The sovereign beauty which I do admire, witness the world how worthy to be praised. The light whereof hath kindled heavenly fire, in my frail spirit by her from baseness raised. That being now with her huge brightness dazed, base thing I can no more endure to view, but looking still on her I stand amazed, at wondrous sight of so celestial hue. So when my tongue would speak her praises due, it stopped is with thought's astonishment, and when my pen would write her titles true, it ravished is with fancy's wonderment. Yet in my heart I then both speak and write, the wonder that my wit cannot endite. The sovereign beauty.
All right, yes, we're going to look at Spenser's Sonnet 3 here from Emirati 3, The Sovereignty Beauty, as you just heard. If you look at this particular screen, you can kind of tell I sort of marked the heck out of this particular poem. And really, this is what you probably should have been doing with your short fiction unit, with those 8 stories as well. As you read, you should be annotating the text, right? Marking up the text, questioning the text, adding notes to the text. This is one way that you can take notes on not only poetry, but literature in general. So when we look at this particular poem, there's a couple things that I'm gonna come back to some of the other stuff in week 6 a little bit as far as the handouts and stuff. We will look at this particular poem first. The 2 Sydney poems and the last Spenser poem, we'll probably pick back up on Wednesday. And I will send out the team's request for Wednesday as well, either later today or Tuesday. The other thing is, I should have all the essay 1s graded, I hope, by this time next week, if not sooner. I've already started grading some. There's a couple things that we probably need to talk about a little bit more in general. I may, save that until Wednesday when I grade a little bit more. I know a few people, it just seems like they just didn't follow instructions. They gave me 1 page or 2 pages, or maybe 3. Remember, it needed to be 4 to 5 pages in length. Some of y'all wasn't following the MLA 8 format as it relates to style and guidelines for the paper. Again, I sent all those handouts week after week after week. You might have needed to check your emails if you haven't been checking emails regularly. There was stuff in there as well. How to quote. I've presented a couple different things on that over the last few weeks as well. Make sure you pay close attention about how to quote poetry, because with that next blog coming up, you're going to have to be able to do it, that next discussion question, because it's different. Quoting poetry or verse is going to be different than quoting short stories. So please read that, look over it. If you have any questions, email me, because you don't want to have points taken off because you're not reading the stuff or you're not asking the questions when you need to ask. Waiting until 2 or 3 hours before something is due is probably not the smartest thing to go about doing it either, just because of time. Because I had, a few folks, here it is Sunday, and everybody had nearly 30 days, right? You had 4 or 5 weeks to send me a draft. And then I have folks that want to send me a draft of essay 1, at 6 or 7 o'clock at night. When I told everybody in the email early on that past Friday, or that previous Friday would be the last time I'd be able to read rough drafts. So please follow instructions. Please start these essays a little bit sooner than, the day of or 2 days before. Some of it's kind of obvious when you start reading and realize there's no thesis statements. They don't use textual evidence to support any of their points. They're short with word count and page length. So please pay attention to my final comments when I send those back. All the exams have been graded. The ones that I received have been graded. Again, if you didn't turn it in, you got a 0. Because again, you had 5 weeks to prepare for that as well. So, and I really can't help if you had some computer issues go on, right? If you knew of your computer issues, then you should have got that sort of taken care of or fixed prior to taking the exam. And as you can tell, when you look at the week 6 stuff, you know, a sample exam for the poetry is up. I would download that. I would save it because it's going to be something that you'd want to study and look at as we go from week 6 to week 7 and week 8. Same thing with the next essay question, or essay topic rather, which is over poetry. We will look at some of that here, if not today, definitely on Wednesday. But notice this paper, it has to be a compare and contrast. So you're picking 2 poems that we read over the next 4 or 5 weeks. And you're doing a compare and contrast. You're looking at the similarities and differences. That paper needs to be 5 to 7 pages. So again, when I say 5 to 7, I really mean 5 to 7. I don't mean 2, right? It's not a discussion or a blog. It's not a mini essay. It's a longer essay. So when I say 5 to 7, I really mean 5 to 7. So make sure that you're following the instructions. And if you need help, that you ask way before something is due. You can send stuff to Smart Thinking way before it is due as well. It may just help your grade going into the last month of our semester. All right. So looking at this poem, as you can tell, I have it all marked up. And again, you probably would want to do that as well. You know, copy, print out make yourself a printout of this particular poem or poems when we start reading and start making notes. If you look, one of the things that you're going to find, I'm going to be talking a lot about various poetic terms. Again, I gave you a handout about some of the poetic terms that you should be familiar with for the next 4 or 5 weeks. Please download that, save it, print it out. There's going to be some information in your e-text early on about how to read poems, some of the terms that you would need to know. Again, read that because that's going to be stuff that's going to help when you start writing your essay too. You know what you're talking about as it relates to some of these terms. And then you know what to sort of discuss and ask questions about when you're starting to read some of this poetry. And we start to discuss a little bit more on the discussion boards. So first thing you need to notice is this thing here is called an IM. It's one IM. The U is the unstressed syllable. The slash is the stressed syllable. So if you look, we actually have 5 of these. There's 5 feet, right? We have unstressed stress, unstressed stress, unstressed stress, unstressed stress, unstressed stress. There's 5 of them. So in this particular sonnet, like most sonnets, especially Shakespearean sonnets, which we'll be talking about in a couple weeks, they're usually written in iambic pentameter. You probably heard this before if you studied any plays by Shakespeare. If you notice the rhyme scheme, and the rhyme scheme in this case, we look at the end words, right? We have this particular rhyme scheme for this sonnet: AB, AB, BC, BC, CD, CD, and then we have EE. If you notice, this poem is 14 lines. Most sonnets are. There are a few exceptions. However, this is a particular sonnet. It's a Spenserian sonnet because he actually takes the reverse rhyme scheme of what a Shakespearean sonnet is. And if you look, it's made up of 3 quatrains, and 3 quatrains, in this case, a quatrain is 4 lines. Again, if you go back to your handout of these poetic terms, you can learn the lingo here a little bit. And then our last 2 lines, the EE, are the couplet. And Shakespeare usually has a couplet too. It usually ends in GG. The Sydney poems have couplets too. And we'll look at some of that, you know, for Wednesday. But if you look, usually Spenser's couplets in with yoking together of the spiritual and the flesh. So he's looking at a higher power being that of the a spiritual thing and that of the fleshy body. And if you look actually at this particular sonnet, it's really probably written, they say, around from between 1592 and 1594. It was published in this big Emirati, which is it's a longer piece of work from Sidney. It's one of his sonnet sequence. And it was really published, the whole work was published in 1595. And he wrote this particular Sonnet 3 in celebration of his second marriage to Elizabeth Boyle. So in some ways you could say it's celebrating the marriage. It's sort of wooing her, as we see throughout the poem. If we look, a lot of what you see with Sidney is sort of influenced with Spenser's work. They were both contemporaries of each other. If you look at particular poetics of Sidney or of Spenser here, he is a Renaissance writer, right? Elizabeth world, if you think about it that way. Elizabeth the First, because when we look at this first line, we can kind of talk about, is he really referring to Elizabeth Boyle, his second wife? Could it be Elizabeth the First, which was, of course, the queen and ruler of England at that time? He's really big with Puritanism. Some of y'all might have heard of Puritanism as it relates to maybe early American literature, if you had an American lit class in the past. And he's also into patriotism, right? So if you look at this particular phrase, sovereignty, beauty, again, he's looking at this particular woman. And if we go with the notion he's celebrating his second marriage to Elizabeth Boyle, it makes more sense, I guess, to see her as being too beautiful, to being superior over any other person, including himself, right? You can also look at it too, I guess you can do the flip side. If you want to look at it maybe from the other side, that he is referring to maybe Queen Elizabeth I, which he had some sort of I wouldn't say relationship with, but he did have a fascination for. You can look at that as being earthly sovereign. We also look to see that, this whole baseness raised is he's seeing this beautiful woman, and she's basically, taking his lowly, frail, as it says here, spirit, and basically by her beauty and by her class and by her style and everything, it's actually leading him down a moral path of goodness, or to goodness in this case. If you look at line 3, the light whereof hath kindled heavenly fire. Well, you can kind of look at it, a couple different ways there. It is heavenly, right? The fire here is of a heavenly quality. But if you also look, the fire purifies the spirit. It makes him sort of whole. It makes him morally acceptable. It makes him morally leading down this path to goodness again. It's also, this whole phrase from heavenly fire comes from, another one of his sonnets, which is Sonnet 30. We don't really read it in this particular time frame. But it's something that you can kind of, look at. Again, when you start thinking about essay 2, you can think about comparing, that's why I gave you Spenser's Sidney. You can sort of compare some of these poems that we have. If you want to go off and look at Sonnet 30, as it relates to the Spenser piece, and look at this one as well, that's something we can talk about. But you definitely need to talk about, what you plan on doing, or which poems you plan on, writing about when we get closer to essay 2. And I think that was the problem. I think one person, or it might have been another person, for whatever reason, they turned in an essay 1 that didn't have anything to do with any of the stories. So I don't, can't really grade that based on just turning something in. Yes, there's words on paper, but you needed to pick a text, you needed to pick a topic, and then you needed to discuss to me about what you plan on doing with your text and topic. And that person never did that. So they wasted 5 weeks on, I don't know, right? I don't know what they were doing. So please, if you're going to pick your own topic in the future, I need to know what you plan on doing it before you really get started drafting it. 1, to make sure you're on track. 2, that you have enough that you can talk about. And 3, so we don't run into the issue that I ran in with with this previous student, where they turn in a 3 or 4 page paper and it has nothing to do with this class. So you don't want to wreck your grade that way. So moving on to our second quatrain, right? Because we looked at the first 4 lines, the first quatrain here. We're looking at that we have this hue, right? It says, base thing I can no more endure to view. So this is really a sort of a reference back to Plato's cave image, book 7 of the Republic. I don't know if anybody's actually read that or seen that before, but it's way back, way before Spencer's time. But what's going on really with these next 3 or 4 lines is that he's so puzzled, he's so mesmerized by this lady's beauty that he's sort of stuck. He's in this trance. He can't really move or do anything. And really what he wanted to do, as we see in the last quatrain, was he wanted to take his tongue and basically speak. He wanted to speak the good fortune, the good nature. He wanted to tell everybody that, who is close by or who would listen, how beautiful this woman in his presence is. But going back to when we start looking at the 2 sonnets from Sidney, there's this motif that really applies to Sidney's work more so than Spencer, but this sort of carries on, and this is where they sort of influence, or at least Sidney sort of influences Spencer here. And the idea that throughout this whole poem is that the poet, or the speaker, you can say Spencer in this case, and that's another thing that we're going to have to sort of talk about, is be careful of saying that the speaker or the poet is always representative of, the author of the poem, because sometimes that's true and sometimes that's not. It depends on the personality and the persona that's going on in that particular poem. But in this case, we could say that the poet / speaker is one and the same, being that it's Spencer. And that is the idea of struggling to write about a woman only to have an eureka moment, which enables the poet, in this case, and enables Spencer to tell the world, or to tell, whoever he wanted to tell in public about the particular woman. In some ways, though, he's letting his poetry, his creation here, do that for him. Right? He's, in the present, we're back here between 1592 and 1594, and the speaker's having a hard time. He sees this beautiful woman, right? We assume that it is Elizabeth Bull, his second wife. And he's wanting to tell the world just how beautiful this lady is. But, he's so mesmerized, he's so stunned, he's so shocked, he's sort of stuck or frozen in that moment. He can't really get the words out, but he writes them down. And that's sort of what we get at here with this whole yoking together the spiritual and the flesh with these last 2 lines, 13 and 14, is that he's able to write them down and save them for another day. And that, of course, that another day is for us, right? We're still talking about Spencer and Sidney and Shakespeare way after they're long and dead. People will probably be talking about him after we're long and dead. And it's because it's through his words here, he's able to get out this beauty of this woman, how special she was. Some other things that we can kind of look at, right? Her beauty, her goodness, right? Her presence, her appearance dwarfs and dominates him. If you go back to thinking about where we're at, right? This is Spencer. We're over in England. We're in the 1500s, right? Late 1500s, early 1600s. And if you notice, there is sort of a difference when we look at this particular male poet, sort of describe a woman, right? In this case, it's probably his wife. But if you go back to look at some of the short stories who were written by women, like the Chopin piece or the Gilman piece, women were, and of course, when we look at this point, 18th, 19th century, were treated or looked down upon differently. So it's really interesting to see how a male writer here, in this case, a male poet, Spenser, in the 15 and 1600s, is treating women in general. Because even though this is his wife, you can go through and look at some of his other works, and there's a different sense or a different style to how he describes women. And it's one of them more of a favorable. Because if you look back at the Chopin, Miss Mallard, she was sort of, suppressed or stuck in this male-dominant society. And it's still the same. I mean, 1600s, you're still in a male sort of dominant society, even though Queen Elizabeth I is your queen, you're still sort of in a male-dominant society, even in England. And if you look to the celestial hue that they talk about here in line 8, not only talks about the woman's physical appearance, her complexion, but this celestial, right? We're talking about the heavens. It's lifting him just by her mere presence, seeing her shine through his eyes, is lifting his spirits and lifting his ability to a higher ideal of beauty. I mean, he's going beyond just the physical beauty. He's going more to a spiritual beauty here as well. And that's where, going back here, her beauty is so dominating that it's hard for him to express in words what he wants to say. He has to say it, basically in his heart, and from his heart, he's able to write it down. But that's the only place where it basically goes until, us being the readers actually pick it up and read it and gather that from him. So it's one of those, it's really sort of a neat poem about love, about beauty, about a man, about a woman, about a husband, about a wife. So if you look at, the Sonnet 75, it's another one that's sort of devoted to Elizabeth Boyle, just to give you sort of a hint. But you can kind of look at that to see, is there any comparison between that one, Sonnet 75, and his Sonnet 3 here? When you get to the Sidney pieces, he's talking more about a lady named Stella, which is really a pseudonym for somebody else, and we'll talk a little bit more about that on Wednesday. But Stella is not really his wife. She's sort of, involved with somebody else. He's having a little bit more of a infatuation or affection toward her. But again, you can sort of look at those two sonnets from Sidney, and you can compare and contrast those two. You can take one from a Sidney piece and compare it with one of the Spenser pieces, or when we get to Shakespeare, you can look at some of the Shakespeare sonnets as well. So you have a lot to work with as we move along. When you start thinking about essay 2, again, I would get to the habit where you're taking notes, right? And I think that's sort of a big problem that college students have these days, is either they don't take notes, they think they can remember everything that's being said or read, which nobody can, or they never really been properly taught how to take notes. I mean, how does one take notes, really? It's sort of one of those things you sort of learn through each grade, right? Each level of your life, you learn how to take notes a little bit better. On the computer, because I had to do it this way to be able to show you, this wasn't necessarily the greatest or the easiest way to take notes, because if you ever use the mouse to write on a page, it gets sloppy, as you can kind of tell. It's not the greatest, but in a lot of ways, you want these things to get sort of sloppy on you too. because it's showing mainly you that, hey, you're really depacking, right? You're unpacking this particular sonnet or this particular poem. As long as you can sort of make sense of it, is what you're going to have to, get to. If you look down to, just to talk a little bit more here, if you notice about line 12, when it deals with a Spenserian sonnet, we have this Italian term, and we'll talk a little bit more about this because it does pop back up again in the Sidney sonnets and the Shakespearean sonnets, the Volta, which basically means the turn. It's sort of like, you could say, like the climax of the poem. It turns, it shifts. Sometimes it shifts from the negative to the positive. Sometimes it goes from the positive to the negative. So keep that in mind when you're looking at the Sidney sonnets and when you're looking at the Shakespearean sonnets here in a couple weeks. This word fancy is sort of an old word. I would say old word, but when you look at Spenser and Sidney's work, and even Shakespeare, a lot of folks will say, well, that's old English. No, it's not. It's really more Middle English. You're getting more into the modern English. Old English would be stuff like Beowulf and that type of stuff. That's really old English. And even Chaucer. Chaucer's not really old English. It's still sort of a, Middle English in a lot of ways. So fancy, though, is another word for imagination, right? So if you look at it that way, his imagination is really running wild with how of amazement of this lady's beauty, right? By how she conducts herself, how she dressed, how she looks, how she smells, that type of stuff. I mean, it's sort of that whole package of this woman. In this case, I guess it would be, Elizabeth Bull, his wife. You could probably make the argument, even though he doesn't mention Bull by name, that he could be talking about Elizabeth I. And the reason why I bring that up, and again, this is where sort of English or European history or world history sort of blends in with literature. It's always a good thing to have a little bit of background information about sort of the period pieces, about who Elizabeth I is, what she stood for, what party does she belong to, that type of stuff, because it does help when you get to talk about and discuss some of these poems, because you can kind of know maybe was going on in the writer's mind or the poet's mind at the time. So hopefully at some point you've had some world history or European history and talked a little bit about the historical context of what Elizabeth I really means to England. If not, you would do yourself a good service to go and look, whether you watch a couple, brief clips on YouTube, on Hulu, on Netflix, you read about it, something. Because Elizabeth was also, instrumental, her atmosphere, her rule was still around when Sidney was around, was still around when Shakespeare was around. So it makes a good notion, a good idea that you go and sort of learn a little bit about the history of some of these pieces as well, especially during the late 1600s in England, what was going on. All right. So let's look real quick, and I'm gonna get out of here. So if you look, I basically squeeze. Sometimes we call this a lemon exercise, where you squeeze stuff out. We try to make more juice out of what's there. And if you did that a couple more times with another poem, I can easily probably take what I have here and come up, as I start brainstorming and outlining for an essay too, pretty much my notes here and notes from another poem, I would probably have a good rough start that I could start thinking about my essay too, and start coming up with some pages, from one week to the next week to the week after. Because really you want to probably have a good bit of this essay done, so you can start sending, me drafts and smart thinking drafts. So if we go back to our page here. And if you look, I went ahead and opened up a good bit, and I think I talked about this last time. Week 6 is open, 7, 8, 9. I probably have to add a little bit to week 9, and of course I'm gonna have to add stuff to week 10. But really, the next 6, 7, and 8 are all open and ready to go. Just be careful that you're reading instructions if you decide to work ahead, right? Especially when it deals with the discussion board questions or the quizzes. Make sure that you're reading the stuff not only for that week but the previous week, so you have a general idea of what's going on. I think somebody yesterday, besides turning in essay 1, which was good, which was what y'all needed to do, went ahead and started work on week 8 work. Turned something in that was supposed to be turned in on October 18th. But obviously, when I read it, knew that this person didn't really read any of the poems or read the instructions. So only jump ahead when you're ready. You have read the stuff carefully and you read the material, for that week and for the weeks prior to that. Because otherwise, you're going to post stuff and it's not going to make much sense when I read it. So just be careful of that, please. If you look, week 6, and I'm basically just going to briefly go through this, right? This is 9 pages of poetic devices. Will you need to know all of these? No. Will you need to know some of these? Yes, because they're going to be helpful when it comes to quiz time, discussion time, when we talk about stuff either in pre-recorded videos or live Teams lectures. Obviously, your exam and your essay 2 coming up. So definitely do yourself some service and go through some of this and look at some of it, because just like the handouts I gave for short stories and short fiction, this is the stuff that critics use when they analyze poetry. They use these terms. And if you look here, here's sort of the deal with the sonnets. That might be something that you might want to really look at for this week, because it tells you sort of the rhyme scheme for the different types of sonnets that we have. Images of words, right? We're going to be talking about imagery and tone and mood soon enough. So even though it's 9 pages, right? If you take a little bit at a time and sort of go through this, you won't be, let's say test time, won't be surprised if you see a couple of these words up there and want you to define them, or use them to define something in a particular quotation or something of that nature. So please, download this stuff, save it, because folders are only open from Sunday to Sunday. They only stay open for 7 days. After that, they shut down so I can upload the next week's stuff, because Blackboard doesn't like a whole lot of stuff up there. It kind of screws it, it screws up the program a little bit. So that's why I have to sort of close particular folders down after a 7-day period. So make sure that you're saving these, downloading these, printing these out, whatever the case may be. Again, poetic imagery. This is an actual web page. It goes through the 7 types. This will probably be a little bit more helpful as it gets closer, maybe to next week. But you can use some of the stuff for the sonnets for this week as well. So I definitely look at that, or at least save that address so you can come back to look at it. If you Poetic Stanzas, again, this is going to take you to another sort of web page that has 12 or 10 standard types of stanza forms in poetry. So it's something we talked about quatrain today, couplets today. We're going to be looking at some of these other ones too throughout, the next 3 or 4 weeks. So this is going to be a good site to keep in mind and look at. It has a little video that might be helpful here too. If you look, I give you some information about Shakespeare, Sidney, and Spenser. Really, for this week, you just need to really focus on the Sidney and Spenser piece. But Shakespeare will be coming up here in a couple weeks, so this might be one of those web pages you'd want to keep close by so you can come back to it. Or you can go ahead and read all about all 3 of them this week too, to save yourself a little bit of time. Of course, you got the 2 Sidney sonnets and the 2 Spencer sonnets. Here's the thing I was talking about, how to quote poetry. And I put this up there a week or so ago too. I think I emailed it to everybody, and I also put it throughout, some of the weekly folders prior to last week. And it not only tells you how to set up the MLA style paper, right? You need a header, works cited page, title, that type deal. And it gives you some examples, right? If you looked at this would basically tell you how to set up your essay 1 and essay 2. Talks about plagiarism right now. I haven't had anybody that was guilty of that. Again, when you submit essay 1 and 2, and pretty much really any work, when you submit that stuff, it's going through a safe design or Turnitin program. And when you see a number, a lot of folks will go back and kind of check and say, well, why do I got, a 67% on this? Or why is it, why is there a certain color scheme next to my file on Turnitin? And really that's telling me and telling you that there's a possibility that there's some plagiarism on that paper. And what Turnitin it does, or Safe Assign does, if you're not used to it, is if you've been copying and pasting, if you've been stealing information, if you bought a paper, if you've been getting stuff and not giving that particular source the proper credit, if you're passing on as your own work, those programs are basically in real time going to find it. It's going to highlight it in your paper, and it's going to highlight it in the actual original paper. And once I have that, right, then, you're guilty of plagiarism. And the first offense is always going to be a 0, right? You can't say, well, I didn't do that, or somebody else copied from me. That's not going to work, right? Because most of these sources that you would find on the internet have been written way before you wrote that paper Sunday. So be careful of that. If you don't know how to quote, right? If you don't know how to do a works cited page, if you don't know how to quote poetry, that's one reason why we're looking at this paper, or this particular handout now. But that's another reason why to get these drafts into me a lot sooner, so you don't get caught with a plagiarism charge, say on essay 2. Because if you get caught the second time, you're going to fail the class. We're going to go before the powers that be at the college. They're going to determine whether you should stay in college, or they kick you out or suspend you for a good bit of time. Sometimes it's for life. Sometimes it's for a couple of semesters or a year. But the result's not going to be good, because it's sort of going to stick to your transcript. So again, when in doubt, don't plagiarize. It's not worth it. People have lost their jobs because of it. People have, lost scholarships because of it. People have been barred from this college, for a very long time. Some have actually been barred for good. They have to go to another college. And even then, it's on their transcript. So a lot of folks won't be wanting you to come to their particular institutional of higher learning, because they're going to say, well, you cheated in one place. How do we know you're not going to cheat here? We don't want to ruin our reputation because you bought that paper online, or you copied and pasted that paper, or you borrowed it from a friend who had the same class 2 years ago. So you want to be careful of that. Parenthetical citation, also known as in-text citation. Again, we looked at this a little bit a couple weeks ago. This is really more or less for short stories and fiction. So you might want to go back and look at some of this as it relates to short stories and fiction. The reason why I'm saying that, because some of y'all had issues with that with essay 1 that I've graded so far, and it's going to be a problem as we go closer into November, when we talk about the research paper, and you're going to have to use sources other than poetry and drama. You're going to have to actually go to databases or Galileo or a library and use books and journal articles that are written in prose writing. So you're going to need to know how to quote prose writing again, not just for the first month. So that would sort of help. Other ways that you can, you want to look at probably page 5 here, where it's talking about methods of including ideas from other texts in your paper. So how to quote properly. Some of y'all don't realize that you need to have a colon to to go and introduce your quote. As you can tell with this particular, how they do the Shakespeare, this is incorrect here. And you can kind of say, well, here, this is why it's incorrect, because you're just dropping the quote in. There's no colon. You need a colon after agent. You can have the last name and the page number. If you use that particular author, right? And if it's only one, in this case with essay 2, you're probably going to have to, depending on, you're probably only going to have 2 poems. So it's probably only going to be like, let's say, Sidney and Shakespeare. So after you mention their name once, you can just go with the page number. But, I say that with page number, but when we get to poetry, you're actually going by line number. So that's sort of the reason why I did this here. I don't know if you can see this. I have one. You're going to have to count your own lines if they're not provided. So this would be line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So this is a 14-line poem. Notice there's no line numbers. I had to provide those. And you're going to have to do that as well when it comes to writing about poetry. You're going to have to tell me the line number you're getting the information from as it relates to textual evidence from that poem. Otherwise, I mean, it's just like you're not giving me any information as far as you're just giving me something general. I need to see something specific. And I think that's part of the problem with some of the essay ones was that some of the students just were not giving me any quotations. They, you would give me general ideas about what was going on in the short story, or you'd give me too much plot information, but you wouldn't back up, any of your claims, or you wouldn't back up any of your major points with any quotations from the actual text. That's not analysis, right? That's just giving me plot summary, stuff that, anybody could find on Cliff Notes, Spark Notes, or any of those, Cliff Note type pages. I can read those all day long. I can go to Wikipedia and read those all day long. That's not what good literary analysis is. And that's why I did, send out some stuff about literary analysis, I think during week 2 and week 3. So I'm hoping everybody was able to print some of that stuff out. The whole deal about me putting stuff on the weekly folders is for you to print it out or save it, or save the web address so you can come back to it and see it later. Not just for that particular week, but you may need it for weeks 4 or 5. And if you're not doing that, then that might be the reason why your grade is not doing as well, because you're not keeping up with the material in the class. You're only looking at it one time and throwing it away. You can't do that with 1102 English. It's like with poetry and short stories. You can't just read it once and say that, oh, I know what it means. No, you're going to have to read some of this stuff multiple times. If you don't have time for it, you're just going to have to make time for it. Otherwise, your grade right now may be pretty strong. You may like where it's at, but over time, if you're not putting in the work to get make the effort to do well, your grade's going to decrease. It's never going to stay the same. It's always going to either increase if you do well moving ahead, or decrease as we move ahead. So please keep that in mind. If you look here, it gives you a couple incorrect and correct quotes. Again, go back and look at these as it relates to the short fiction stuff, because you're going to need to know how to do it again come November. It talks a little bit about short quotes as it relates, right? It talks about punctuation, use ellipsis, that type deal. Long quotes, when we talk about block quotes, this is what a block quote looks when you're doing short stories. Some of y'all had those. Some of y'all did them right. Some of them didn't, because they didn't send a draft at all, had a whole bunch of block, stuff in their paper that needed to be block quoted, but they didn't block quote it. So they're going to be losing points because, again, they didn't send any drafts. And how do I know to be able to help somebody if they don't take the initiative to send me stuff? So basically what a block quote is if you're quoting something 4 lines or more when it deals with prose writing, it's a little different when it's verse or poetry. You highlight everything that you're quoting. and then you tab it twice for 10 spaces. So if you sort of take your cursor and go around this particular quote, it looks like a square or a block, hence the name block. Notice punctuation pretty much stays the same throughout this quote. There's no open or closed quotation marks. Because it's a block, we know that it's a block by the way it looks, the shape. Again, we have this colon, not semicolon. A lot of y'all were using semicolons when I put colon in your margin, not semicolon. So please make sure you know the difference between those two. And if you notice here, our in text, instead of having the period on the outside of your citation, right, they have it in the inside, pretty much before it. After which you never want to block or you never want to indent the next line after a block quote. You want to keep it left aligned because you need to talk about this particular block quote. The general consensus is, and I know this is just an example, but with every line that you have blocked, you need to give me double that in your analysis. So let's say here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So really they should be about 12 lines of analysis here about this Romeo and Juliet quote for it to really be good, great, on-point literary analysis, right? Without the plot summary, you're really digging deep and analyzing this particular passage from that play or short story or novel or poem or whatever the case may be. This talks a little bit about summarizing and paraphrasing. Again, if you're summarizing and paraphrasing and it's still not your particular work, right? You're getting information from another source, primary source or a secondary source. You still need to cite it in textually. You need to provide a works cited page for it at the end. This gives you some tips. So you might want to go back and look at pages 5, 6, and 7. This talks a little bit about poetry, and this is really what I was going to get at, more so since that's what we're talking about now. We will come back to drama as it gets closer to drama. But remember, really the first 7 of these pages here, you should have learned whenever you took 1101, because that's what I teach in 1101. Hopefully whoever you had for 1101 taught that as well, because you should have done a research paper. I usually do a research paper in 1101. So as it relates to prose writing, you should have known how to properly set up and put quotes in with MLA style, especially if you have had a literature class within the last year or two. Okay, poetry. So if you're quoting 3 lines or fewer of poetry or a verse, you want to separate each line with a slash and include the line numbers and the author's last name if necessary in the parenthetical citation at the end of the poetic lines. Retain the original same punctuation, spelling, and capitalization. Use quotation marks to set the boundaries for the beginning and end of the poetic lines. So if you look here, here's one line or a part of a line, right? Notice how this particular quotation is just sort of blended in with the rest of the sentence. You can do it that way, right? Notice this is line number, not page number. So make sure when you're talking about a line number or a particular word, you're going to have to give me the line number, not page number. So you're going to have to count your own lines in poetry. If they're not provided for you, you're going to have to do it. Here's 2 or 3 lines. Notice 2, he is described as some boy too far from town to learn baseball. And then we have this slash. Well, if you look here, this is telling me this is from Frost, Branch's poem, lines 25 through 27. Well, that's telling me this is line 25. When you get to your next line, because you're taking a break, right? You're going from one line to the next. That's why you have the slash. This is line 26. And then before we get to line 27, we have the slash again. Here's line 27. So that's why you need to put the slash there when you go between lines. Otherwise, they're just going to run together and they're going to look more like prose writing, which again, we're not quoting novels, short stories, journals. We're quoting verse, we're quoting poetry. So make sure that you know the difference between the two so you're not losing points in the weeks ahead. If you're quoting 4 or more lines, you got to block it, right? Block the poetry off from the rest of your text. Indent each line 10 spaces or 1 inch. Basically, it's 2 tabs again. From the left margin, double space between each line. If your sentence that introduces the block quote does not flow smoothly with the lines, place a colon. So again, here it goes smoothly with it. That's why we don't need a colon there. But if it didn't go smoothly when you read the sentence, then you need the colon. No quotation marks are used when poetry is blocked off. The line numbers are placed in the parenthetical citation immediately following the last word or end punctuation of the poem. So again, notice no quotation marks at the beginning, no quotation marks at the end. It keeps the original style of the particular verse. The period comes before the citation. 18 through 23 are telling me it's 18, 19, 20. You know, these are particular lines, not page numbers. Omitting words from a poem. If you need to omit text from a quoted poem, use 3 ellipsis points, basically. To indicate the omission, if you need to omit an entire line of poetry, use a line of ellipsis, similar to the length of the line in the poem. So here, if you need to eliminate a couple particular phrases, you're only going to use the 3 elliptical points. If you need to do a whole line, like this would be considered line 3 because this is line 1, 2, and then we get 4 here. Then you have to do it. You know, you had to give me multiple elliptical points here about the length of that line, whatever, how long line 3 was. And it looks like it's about, you know, the same length as line 1 and line 4 here. So a good thing to look at would be pages 1 through 8 on this particular sheet when it deals with how to cite poetry, how to cite prose writing, because you're going to need to know how to do both moving forward. Let's see. Discussion board, you can kind of look at the question there. It's basically wanting you to compare and contrast the attitudes of Spencer and Sydney express about love. How are their views of women similar and different? How are their views of love similar and different? By using their poems that you read for week 6 and using textual evidence, quotations from their poems. So yes, you need to use quotations from one of the, you know, both of the poems that you decide to compare and contrast here to support your major claims and points. You want to answer the question in the prompt in a well-developed paragraph. So, you know, if you're going to add a couple quotes from a Sydney poem and a Spencer poem, you're probably going to have more than 2 or 3 sentences. So you need to start thinking, because the next paper is 5 to 7 pages anyway, you need to start writing longer sentences in your paragraphs. So what I would suggest at this point, probably a good sized paragraph would be probably about 8 to 12 sentences in length. That will probably give you enough time to quote a little bit and to be able to, you know, talk and analyze and interpret some of your major points and claims. At the same point, you need to go ahead and respond to one of your classmates, and probably a good, well-developed paragraph too. So again, about 8 to 12 sentences. Please proofread your work, because spelling and grammar and citations will count against your grade. Some of y'all, when y'all are responding to people, y'all just basically giving me one word or, you know, 2 sentences, and you're not really backing up anything. You're just sort of giving me generalization of that particular answer to the question of that, you know, whoever wrote that particular response. You're not sort of, and I'm not saying you have to get up there and criticize or challenge, but you need to do a little bit more, you know, analysis a little bit. Maybe ask questions like, how do you know that this is what this particular writer is wanting you to get across or think about? Because a lot of folks are just going on there and saying, well, I agree or concur with what you said. And I basically said the same thing, and then they're basically ending their sentence, and then that's it. So make sure that you're giving us, not only me, but make sure that you're giving the particular person that you're responding to a little bit more too, because otherwise it's just, you're not giving me a lot. You're giving me more grizzle than the steak, and we want more steak. Because the steak tastes better than the gristle does. So just sort of keep that in mind as we move through these weekly writing exercises. All right, the poetry essay. If you haven't looked at it, it's there. We're going to pull that up. Again, the next couple of weeks, you're going to have a you're going to have a Dropbox in the week 10 folder for this particular essay. But if you look, it's going to be due on the 28th of October, which is a Wednesday. It's still going to be in the MLA 8 format, double space, Times New Roman 12. It needs to be 5 to 7 pages in length, or 1,250 to 1,750 words, whichever comes first. So again, the directions basically state your essay 2 will be to type a well-structured thesis-driven essay comparing and contrasting at least 2 poems we have read and examined from weeks 6 through 10. You pick the 2 poems, not me. I can give you suggestions, but ultimately it's going to be up to you to pick the 2 poems. You can't have one. And I would be careful about doing more than 2, really. Because if you do 3, you're sort of off a little bit. Unless you want to do, if you're going to do 2, you might want to, the next step would probably be comparing 4 poems. Just because if you do 3, like I said, you're a little off, and that could be kind of problematic. 4 can be kind of problematic too, just because you got to look at your length here. It only needs to be 7 pages. And again, when I say 5 to 7, I really mean 5 to 7. I don't mean 4 pages. I don't mean 8. I mean between 5 and 7. So if you get at the end and full pages, some of y'all just got to the top of page 4 and kind of conked out on it. Really, it needed to be full 4 to 5 pages for essay 1. And then your works cited page becomes the next page. So let's say you had 5 full pages for essay 1. Well, works cited page becomes page 6, right? So keep that in mind. So again, 5 to 7 pages plus a works cited formatted page, right? If you use easybib.com, that would help you. Make sure that you provide and that you properly cite your in-text citation, parenthetical citation, aka textual evidence, quotations from your poems. In this particular paper, you need to submit essays, drafts to me way before the 28th. I think because we're basically a month away, right? This is September 28th, so we're 4 weeks away. We're 1 month away from when this paper is going to be due. So the 28th of October, again, is a Wednesday. So really probably the last day I can really look at any work would probably be, I'd give y'all up to the 27th, but it's going to have to be early the 27th, like before 5 o'clock. Because, I got other classes Tuesdays in Camden. But if you send something before 5 o'clock on Tuesday, October 27th, I definitely get back to you before the due date on the 28th. I would hope most of y'all would probably submit stuff a lot earlier, than the 27th, because that's a really big rush, and it's hard sometimes to turn stuff around, especially when life intervenes, not only for you, but also for me too. So I would definitely say, give me stuff on the 22nd, 23rd, 24th, 25th, I would have more time to look at it during those 3 or 4 days than I would probably the 26th and 27th, just because I'm teaching, I'm reading other papers, I'm grading other quizzes, and then I'm traveling. So I wouldn't wait necessarily to the 27th, but I give everybody up until, 5 o'clock maybe on the 27th, if, last minute stuff. But keep in mind, anything after 5 o'clock on the 27th, if you email me and say, hey, can you look at this? It's at 8 o'clock at night on the 27th. I'm probably just going to ignore it, right? Because, you've had, especially if that's your first time, you had 4 or 5 weeks to send me stuff, and you're waiting, less than 24 hours before a major paper is due, then I can't really help you there if this is your first draft that you sent me the whole time. Utilize smart thinking. I would do that as well as send me stuff. Let other folks outside of class look at your work as well. Let's see. The other thing that we were going to look at, here's the sample poetry exam, which again is sort of set up as the fiction exam. It's dealing with poetry. So obviously, being that this is our first week, some of this stuff you're going to know about, some of it you're probably not. So by the time we get to, the end of week 9, you should be able to answer most of these questions, because it's going to deal with the stuff we're going to look at for the next 4 or 5 weeks. This is how your exam is going to look. I know some of y'all were having a little bit of issues with the fiction exam, with your computers and that type of stuff. What I would suggest there is, if you're having issues with your computers, you need to go ahead and address that issue before week 10. Because again, I can't solve the computer issues. That's not my expertise. You need to either go out and talk to IT. You need to find somebody that you trust that can work on your computer, or buy a new computer or something, whatever the case may be. But, I can't help that if you knew weeks ahead of time that, hey, my computer may not be able to handle this type of stuff because it's crashing or it won't save properly. The other thing is that you can do is you can always go to a college. You can always go to one of our sites and use the library computers. You could probably go to the public library and use their computers. If you're at high school, if you're a dual enrollment student, you have computers there at your media center. The one thing I probably wouldn't try to do, and it's kind of difficult to do, I think, is I wouldn't try to do this exam, via Blackboard on my cell phone. Because it just, one, it probably, you're not going to be able to see everything. And 2, cell phones are known to make, have the Blackboard sort of crash on them. And once you click start, it's going to be like the fiction exam. It's going to be about 2 hours once you click start and you don't upload anything, or it crashes on you, but it shows that you started. Well, I have to go by the message on the computer that you did start, but you didn't submit anything. Because I really have no proof, right? It's sort of your word against the computer word, and I have to go by what the computer says. Unless you got physical proof that you can show me at that point, right? Not, 3 days later, this is what happened. No, you need to show it to me then, right? Because you can doctor photos and that type of stuff. It's really easy to do if you know what you're doing. All right. I think that's a good bit of information. We can stop there. I'm thinking about also possibly, giving like 1 or 2 virtual office hours throughout the week, meaning we would still sort of do the pre-recorded meetings on Mondays and have the live team meetings on Wednesdays. But, maybe after or prior to those, I will just send everybody a link. Probably be for like 1 hour. You can come on and ask a question, sort of like a tutoring meeting too, if you want to. You don't have to stay, an hour. If you have something that's really quick, you can ask me something. If you need tutoring, we can talk a little bit more. It's not mandatory, but I thought maybe we can spice up some of the weeks a little bit by doing that. Maybe it interchanged have a couple, sort of office hours instead of having a pre-recorded video or a live team meeting. But we'll see how that goes. If you're interested in, approaching the class that way, it will be helpful to hear some feedback from you. Otherwise, we will probably try to start that maybe next week. And I'll give you more information as we get later in the week about it, if you're interested in having some virtual office hours or virtual tutoring. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy the poetry and stuff this week. Good luck on the week 3 writing that's due at the end of the week. And hopefully everybody do really well on the remaining papers that I got to read, which I need to go ahead and get started with before my time runs out here. But don't hesitate to send me an email if you have any questions. Have a good Monday, have a good Tuesday, and I'll see hopefully maybe a good somebody on Wednesday.